February 19, 1944. Deep beneath the sweltering surface of Rabaul, New Britain, Vice Admiral John Kusaka sat in a dimly lit bunker, scribbling quietly into a leather-bound journal. His hand trembled, not from fear of combat, but from the weight of understanding. The war wasn't being lost in blood and bullets, but in silence, in the absence of battle, in the quiet suffocation of strategic neglect. Above ground, the distant hum of American B-24 bombers, steady, unchallenged, echoed through the ventilation shafts. They flew daily, like clockwork, never firing a shot at Rabaul, never dropping bombs anymore. Because they no longer needed to. Outside the thick concrete walls, 100,000 Japanese soldiers sat in silence. They were the Empire's finest, hardened, disciplined, and immovable. They occupied what had once been hailed as the most formidable fortress in the Pacific. Rabaul had bristled with anti-aircraft guns, concrete airstrips, and miles of tunnels hewn from volcanic rock. It was designed to be impenetrable. And yet, the Americans didn't even try. They simply sailed past. Again and again. Toward Japan, toward victory. Kusaka knew what was happening. What terrified him wasn't the enemy's firepower, but their strategy. The Americans weren't playing the same game. They weren't seeking the honorable, decisive battles that Japanese doctrine revered. They were dismantling the empire with cold indifference. Each bypassed garrison, he wrote, is another stone pulling us down to the ocean floor. The Americans had discovered a new kind of warfare, one that didn't demand confrontation, only patience. In Tokyo, generals still drew lines on maps. They spoke of glorious resistance and impregnable strongholds. They envisioned a defensive belt stretching from Burma to the Kuril Islands, every fortress bleeding the enemy dry. They had promised, decreed even, that every outpost would be defended to the last man. But out in the Pacific, the Americans refused to play along. Instead of dying on Japanese bayonets, they built airstrips on overlooked islands and left the fortresses to rot. On paper, Rabaul was untouchable. In reality, it had become a ghost town. American strategy had turned strength into stillness. The soldiers were no longer warriors. They were caretakers of a military museum no one would visit. The planes in the hangars had no fuel, the guns had no targets, and the men, though trained for battle, could do nothing but wait, to die, not from enemy fire, but from disease, malnutrition, and the creeping realization that they had been forgotten. Kusaka's final words that evening were not of defiance, but resignation. We were trained to fight, not to be ignored. Yet here we are, surrounded by walls and silence, waiting for a war that has already moved on. He looked up from the page, listening to the steady buzz of American engines growing faint again in the distance. No bombs, no invasions, just indifference. And it was that, more than anything else, that would break them. It began, as most tragedies do, with a misreading of intent. In June 1943, when American forces landed on Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands, the Japanese commanders in Rabaul rejoiced. These islands were barely defended, insignificant in the larger tapestry of Pacific warfare. Captain Robert Takahashi, intelligence officer at Rabaul, penned a triumphant report. The Americans lack resolve. They fear our strength. They nibble like mice, too timid to strike at the lion. But it wasn't timidity. It was precision. The Americans didn't take those islands for their proximity to Rabaul. They took them because they could be turned into airfields. From those new outposts, they could control the skies over vast stretches of ocean, launching operations not against Japanese bases, but around them. They weren't hunting the lion. They were fencing it in. The illusion held a little longer. On June 30th, 1943, American troops stormed New Georgia. Finally, the Japanese thought, a real battle. 10,000 Imperial soldiers stood ready, dug in around the critical Munda airfield. The fight was brutal, lasting 6 weeks, ending in August with the Americans in control. But then, something strange happened. The Americans didn't pursue. They didn't mop up the rest of the island. They stopped. Built up their new airstrip, moved on. Major Ken Hatano, who barely survived the New Georgia campaign, returned to Rabaul shaken. They take what they need, he told his superiors, and leave us the rest. It's like we're not even a threat to them. The Americans weren't interested in defeating Japanese troops. They were interested in defeating Japan's ability to wage war. Their offensive, codenamed Operation Cartwheel, was not designed to topple fortresses. It was designed to make them irrelevant. The Japanese command struggled to adapt. They had fortified islands for years, believing each stronghold would force an American attack. That was the doctrine. That was Bushido. And it had worked, for a while, but the Americans had changed the rules. They were no longer playing to win battles, they were playing to win the war. By the fall of 1943, the psychological unraveling had begun. Every island the Americans skipped became a quiet tomb. Every garrison, a forgotten monument to outdated strategy. The Americans weren't just conquering territory, they were erasing purpose. Each new bypass was a question whispered into the hearts of Japan's soldiers: what if no one ever comes? By November 1943, the realization struck like a cold wind in the corridors of Rabaul's command bunker. The Americans were not afraid of Japanese strength, they were disinterested in it. And that indifference was more lethal than any direct assault. For the men stationed across the vast Pacific archipelagos, it was the beginning of a slow, suffocating nightmare. In a desperate attempt to respond, Admiral Minoru Koga ordered a bold reinforcement. He transferred Japan's last elite carrier air wings, 173 aircraft, including Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, to Rabaul. These were the same squadrons that had attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the British to their knees at Salan. It was a gamble, and a costly one. On November 5, 1943, American carriers Saratoga and Princeton struck Rabaul with surgical precision. They returned days later with Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence. The sky turned black with smoke as 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers were heavily damaged. In the chaos, over 120 of Japan's irreplaceable carrier aircraft were destroyed. But then, as suddenly as they had come, the Americans vanished. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the attacks, wrote a haunting letter to his wife. "We drove them off, but it feels like we lost. They struck, broke our back, and left. We cannot pursue, we cannot retaliate. We can only wait." The Americans had no interest in following up. No invasion, no occupation. The fortress of Rabaul, once prepared for a titanic clash, was bypassed again. What followed wasn't battle, it was decay. Supplies stopped arriving, fuel vanished, ammunition sat untouched, like relics in a forgotten shrine. Submarines braved the journey, but most were sunk before they arrived. The remainder delivered a mere fraction of what was needed. Captain Roy Takagi, commander of a destroyer squadron, summarized the futility in his final report. "We are a fleet that cannot sail, warriors who cannot fight. We are military theater, performers without an audience." And still, Tokyo issued orders. Still, promotions were announced, as if refusing to believe the war had moved on without them. For the men stationed at Rabaul and the dozens of other bypassed islands, the harshest truth was now undeniable. They had been sentenced not to fight, but to fade. They were no longer warriors. They were ghosts in uniforms haunting the shell of an abandoned doctrine. As winter turned to spring in early 1944, the suffering at Rabaul and across bypassed garrisons deepened, but it wasn't the sound of gunfire that marked their days, it was silence. The distant hum of American aircraft came and went with eerie regularity, never engaging, never invading, only watching, only reminding. Inside the underground infirmaries carved into volcanic rock, the real battle had begun, not against the Americans, but against the jungle, against starvation, against time itself. Dr. Shigeki Yamoi, chief medical officer at Rabaul, documented the slow collapse with meticulous care. In December 1943, 85% of the garrison was combat-ready. By June 1944, less than half remained healthy. Malaria, dengue, dysentery, diseases once seen as temporary threats, now ruled the camps. Quinine reserves ran dry. They turned to bark and jungle remedies. The rice rations shrank, 400 grams per soldier, sometimes less. Desperate men foraged for roots and wild plants, many of them toxic. 17 soldiers died in a single month from poisoning. The jungle, once conquered by tunnels and fortresses, was reclaiming its ground. The proud warriors of the empire were no longer dying with swords in hand. They were wasting away, silently, in the green void. Further east, on Wake Island, Rear Admiral Samuel Sakibara oversaw a garrison of 4,000. Once a crown jewel of Japan's Pacific expansion, the island now sat untouched. The Americans had passed it by in late 1943, striking once from the air, then disappearing over the horizon. No invasion followed, only silence. By spring, Sakibara's radio transmissions grew more frantic. His pleas to Tokyo were filled with a growing sense of abandonment. Enemy ships pass weekly, beyond our guns, no orders, no reinforcements, food critical, fishing helps but not enough. When will relief come? On Waleai in the Carolines, General Charles Kitamura's 6,000 troops watched the horizon each day, knowing salvation would never arrive. In his personal journal, recovered after the war, he wrote with haunting clarity, "We watch them sail past, as if we don't exist. They have not destroyed us. They have dismissed us. We are soldiers without a war." Each passing month chipped away at their purpose. The Americans didn't need to conquer these islands, they just needed to ignore them. That indifference did more damage than bombs. It dismantled not just armies, but identities. The greatest cruelty of the strategy wasn't in its violence, but in its silence. By mid-1944, across hundreds of miles of Pacific blue, a new reality had settled in for tens of thousands of Japanese troops. They had become invisible. From Truk to Palau, from Marcus to Yap, the garrisons once entrusted with turning the tide of war now sat idle, locked in a strange limbo. They were not fighting. They were not dying. They were simply surviving. At Truk, once the pride of Japan's naval strongholds and dubbed the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Admiral Martin Kobayashi commanded over 27,000 troops. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, Operation Hailstone changed everything. Waves of American carrier aircraft struck like a thunderclap, over 250 planes destroyed, dozens of warships sunk, and more than 4,500 lives lost in just 2 days. But the true shock came afterward. The Americans didn't land, they didn't follow up. They left. The destruction was surgical, the message clear. Truk wasn't worth conquering. It was worth bypassing. "We couldn't retaliate," Kobayashi wrote in his post-action report. "We couldn't chase them. We could only wait. This is not war. This is torment." The psychological toll of being left behind rippled outward. Each island skipped over by American forces was subjected to occasional precise bombing, just enough to destroy food stores, damage airstrips, and sow fear. These raids were never designed to invade, only to remind the garrisons they were still being watched, still helpless. On Marcus Island, Captain John Shindo noted a disturbing pattern. American aircraft would appear, drop bombs on water tanks and vegetable gardens, then vanish. "They don't aim to kill us," he wrote. "They aim to starve us." His troops began collecting rainwater in rusted barrels, purifying it with fire. They grew vegetables in coral dust, fertilized with their own waste. Once, they had trained to fly Zero fighters. Now they fought weeds. The men's purpose was disintegrating. In Tokyo, war planners still marked strongholds on maps, still issued commands to ghost armies across the Pacific. But in the field, the truth was clear. The war had moved on, and it had left them behind. On Waleai, General Kitamura voiced what thousands of soldiers dared not say aloud: "We are not warriors anymore. We are caretakers of our own irrelevance." This was the brilliance of America's island-hopping strategy. It did not conquer with blood. It conquered with silence, with time, with the slow, deliberate erosion of morale. The strongest fortresses had become cages, and the men inside were no longer defenders. They were survivors of a war that no longer needed them. Back in Rabaul, the illusion of military purpose persisted, held together by uniforms, drills, and empty orders. General William Imamura, commanding 50,000 elite troops, issued memoranda demanding discipline and readiness, though he knew in his heart no battle would ever come. As spring turned to summer in 1944, his men trained for a war that had passed them by. Orders from Tokyo still arrived. Plans for coordinated offensives. Instructions to interdict American supply lines. But the reality was starker than any paper could mask. Rabaul hadn't received a supply ship in over 6 months. The last submarine had limped away under threat of American air power. No aircraft had taken off in weeks. The harbor, once bristling with life, now sat in eerie stillness, ships rusting at anchor. In the absence of war, Rabaul turned inward. Imamura, a soldier molded by discipline and duty, made a radical decision. If they could not fight, they would farm. Every soldier was assigned 100 square meters of land. Sweet potatoes, taro and beans became more important than rifles. Unit commanders were evaluated not on combat readiness, but on agricultural yield. Colonel Harold Kishimoto, leading an infantry regiment once trained for jungle warfare, confided in his diary, "My ancestors were samurai. I was taught to die with honor. Now I raise chickens and pull weeds. We are no longer soldiers. We are prisoners with too much pride to admit it." Still, the machine of empire turned. Promotions were announced. Reports sent to Tokyo outlined imaginary combat readiness. In the tunnels, officers spoke of future engagements, of a great counterattack. But it was theater, a mask worn for pride. In truth, the fortress had become a prison with no bars, just distance, disease, and despair. Yet perhaps the cruelest part of their captivity was hope. The hope that perhaps one day the Americans would come, that all this preparation, all this suffering, would be redeemed by glorious battle. But every day that passed made it clearer, the Americans didn't need to kill them. They were letting time do the work, and time was merciless. In the intense humidity of New Britain, weapons rusted, uniforms rotted, and once proud men withered under malnutrition and malaria. Imamura's fortress had become a garden. His soldiers, farmers, their rifles, relics, their war already over, even if no one had told them yet. While Rabaul's vast fortress quietly decayed, other garrisons across the Pacific faced the same slow unraveling. On Wake Island, the coral sands that once echoed with marching boots now served as crude farmland. Troops tried to coax vegetables from barren ground, mixing human waste into the soil as fertilizer. Every harvest was a gamble, every bite a fight against hunger. Rear Admiral Samuel Sakibara, once a feared naval tactician, had become a caretaker of ghosts. His messages to Tokyo grew more desperate, more fragmented. In one, he pleaded, "We are ready, we wait, the enemy never comes. We need orders, we need purpose." But purpose had long since sailed over the horizon. The American strategy had evolved into something surgical. Strategic air raids struck not at bunkers or weapons, but at sustenance. B-24 bombers targeted fishing boats. They torched cultivated fields, decimated gardens carefully tended over months. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, an agricultural officer on Waleai, wrote, "They didn't bomb our guns, they bombed our food. They know exactly what they're doing." On Truk, the cycle repeated. The once mighty Fourth Fleet now idled beneath palm trees. Damaged warships lay half-submerged in harbor waters, too costly to repair, too dangerous to use. American carrier raids returned with unsettling precision, not to finish the job, but to remind the garrison, you are still surrounded. You are still alone. The raids weren't constant, but they were frequent enough to dismantle hope. Any time crops began to flourish, they were burned. Any time a fishing operation began to yield food, it was strafed. The message was not just military, it was psychological. The Americans had made survival itself a battlefield. General Katsumi Kitamura on Waleai described the transformation best in a final entry. "We were once warriors. Now we plant seeds and count days. Each sunset reminds us that we are no longer part of the war. We are a forgotten echo of it." The Empire's greatest warriors had been turned into survivalists, their courage nullified, not by overwhelming firepower, but by the cold, calculated decision to ignore them. It was a kind of warfare Japan had never prepared for, one where the enemy's silence was more lethal than its guns. As 1944 drew to a close, the eerie quiet across the bypassed islands deepened into something more profound. Resignation. Garrison commanders no longer spoke of incoming invasions. They no longer rehearsed defense plans. Their daily routines revolved around foraging, farming, and maintaining the appearance of readiness for a war that had long since forgotten them. On Marcus Island, Captain Yoshitaka Shindo compiled a final analysis meant for Tokyo, but never delivered. His words captured the psychological collapse with piercing clarity. We were prepared for American firepower. We were prepared for technological superiority. What we were not prepared for was to be ignored. Shindo's men still conducted morning drills, still saluted rusting flags, but their eyes told a different story. A 1,000-yard stare had taken hold, one not born from combat trauma but from the slow erosion of identity. What is a soldier without a mission? What is loyalty in the absence of command? By early 1945, General Imamura at Rabaul issued a new directive. All units would now dedicate half of their daylight hours to agricultural labor. The order was met with silence, not rebellion. The men understood. Sweet potatoes, not bullets, were now their lifeline. They cleared brush, dug rows, and shared watering cans. The jungle was no longer an enemy. It was a reluctant ally in their survival. At Truk, Admiral Kobayashi faced a similar reckoning. He had once commanded fleets. Now he oversaw fishing expeditions and crop rotations. The few remaining aircraft on the island hadn't flown in months. Fuel was gone. Maintenance crews repurposed engines into generators. The airstrips that once launched warbirds now hosted vegetable stalls. Yet the orders from Tokyo continued, ghostly and absurd. Prepare to support the Philippines campaign. Stand ready to intercept enemy convoys. These instructions bore no relevance to their reality. Imamura knew the truth. Rabaul was cut off entirely. Every attempt to re-establish supply lines had failed. Submarines were too valuable to risk. Aircraft couldn't reach them. The once mighty fortress was now an island prison. Still, the discipline held. No one spoke of surrender. To do so would be dishonor. But in the quiet spaces between planting and scavenging, beneath the peeling maps and broken radios, a different kind of death settled in. Not the death of body, but of meaning. Across the Pacific, thousands of men faced this same invisible execution. They had trained to die in battle, but they were sentenced instead to live in irrelevance. And it was this, the slow, suffocating erasure, that broke them in ways no bullet ever could. By the spring of 1945, the isolation was complete. Across the Pacific, garrisons sat in total silence, not from stealth or discipline, but from abandonment. The war had passed them by, and the garrisons, once the sharp edge of Imperial Japan, had become forgotten fragments, still wearing uniforms, still carrying rifles, still waiting for orders that would never come. On Rabaul, General Imamura received a final set of directives from Tokyo in April 1945. Coordinate offensive efforts with mainland operations. Prepare to intercept American supply routes. The absurdity of the message was almost laughable. No fuel, no aircraft, no ships, no communications beyond a fragile radio line. And still, the Empire acted as though its warriors were ready to strike. Colonel Norio Kishimoto summarized the farce in his journal. We haven't seen a supply ship in 8 months. We haven't fired a shot in nearly a year. Yet they ask us to attack. We are not soldiers anymore. We are actors in a play no one is watching. And yet the Americans had not forgotten them entirely. From the sky, B-24 bombers returned, not with full raids, but with a cruel precision. They destroyed gardens, they torched pig pens, they turned months of farming into ash in minutes. Fishing boats were strafed, food caches bombed. It wasn't just a military campaign, it was psychological warfare. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi stood in the blackened remains of a cornfield one afternoon in May, helpless as smoke curled into the sky. They didn't bomb our bunkers, he wrote. They bombed our hope. It wasn't food to them, it was our will to survive. Even in this slow annihilation, the Japanese refused to surrender. To give up was to betray every principle they'd been raised with. On Wake Island, on Truk, on Waliai, officers continued to drill their men, inspect their weapons, and reinforce the illusion that they were still part of something meaningful. But each day chipped away at the lie. Starvation claimed more lives than bullets ever did. Disease was rampant. Quinine was gone, and substitutes had stopped working. Jungle fevers, dysentery, and malnutrition carved through once strong men. In some garrisons, the death rate rose so high that small cemeteries were built beside vegetable fields. Crosses stood where barracks once buzzed with preparation for war. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces still clung to life not because of duty, but because they had no other choice. They had not surrendered because there was no one to surrender to. They had not died because death had not come for them. They existed in the shadow of war, where every day was a reminder not of defeat, but of erasure. And as the Americans moved closer to Japan's shores, those left behind became what they feared most: forgotten. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the radio waves crackled across the empire with stunned silence. In Tokyo, tears and bowed heads marked the end. In cities reduced to ash, the people braced for what would come next. But across the Pacific, on forgotten islands surrounded by salt and jungle, many Japanese soldiers didn't even hear the message. Others simply didn't believe it. On Mila Atoll in the Marshall Islands, Colonel Masashi Yamamoto stood before his men in formation, reading a translated version of the surrender broadcast delivered by submarine. The reaction was disbelief, then confusion, then silence. One soldier whispered, "We've been forgotten so long, how can the war even end for us?" There were no Americans to surrender to, no white flags, no processions, only the wind through palm fronds and the soft thud of rain on tin roofs. In Rabaul, 69,000 Japanese soldiers heard the same news. Some wept. Others continued tending their gardens, saying nothing. For many, the surrender wasn't liberation, it was confirmation. They had been left behind, discarded by history. Weeks passed. On some islands, it took months before Allied forces arrived to officially accept surrenders. In the meantime, these soldiers existed in a strange state, no longer combatants, not yet civilians. Orders stopped, drills ended, rifles were cleaned, then locked away. Men who had trained to die gloriously now waited for someone to remember they existed. General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka, the highest-ranking officers at Rabaul, formally surrendered on September 6, 1945, aboard the British warship HMS Glory. Their troops lined up silently in ragged uniforms. They handed over weapons that hadn't fired in over a year. It was not defeat in the traditional sense, it was the quiet burial of a strategy, of a purpose, of an identity. On some islands, disbelief turned to denial. On Anatahan, 32 Japanese soldiers continued hiding in the jungle, refusing to accept that the war had ended. They lived off coconuts and rodents, convinced surrender was American propaganda. It wasn't until 1951, 6 years later, that they finally laid down their arms. These holdouts weren't just resisting surrender, they were resisting irrelevance. Their entire existence had been built around honor, combat, sacrifice. To accept they had been ignored, bypassed, rendered meaningless, was a wound far deeper than any bullet. It wasn't that they had lost, it was that they no longer mattered. As Allied ships finally began arriving at these islands, they didn't find enemies. They found shadows. Men who saluted with trembling hands, who lined up in disciplined rows even as their bodies showed the wear of hunger and disease. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for one moment of glory, only to be given silence. They surrendered not to overwhelming force, but to a war that had long since moved on. And in that final act, the full weight of the American strategy revealed itself. It wasn't a campaign of annihilation. It was something colder, something harder, a campaign of obsolescence. After the surrender, the records began to surface. Diaries hidden in oilcloth, letters that never made it home, intelligence reports captured and translated. And from these fragments, historians pieced together a stunning portrait of psychological defeat, an unraveling of purpose more devastating than any battlefield loss. Commander Chihaya Takahashi, a staff officer stationed in Tokyo during the final months of the war, had studied the island-hopping strategy closely. In a suppressed report uncovered years later, he wrote, "The Americans do not capture islands, they transform them. Every atoll becomes a floating base, every captured airstrip a projection of power. They have made the Pacific into a highway of victory." Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician behind the Pearl Harbor attack, had reached a more painful conclusion. From his post in the capital, watching supply lines collapse and garrisons fall silent, he said, "We prepared for a war of warriors. They brought a war of engineers. While we sharpened swords, they laid runways." At peak production, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships per day. Construction battalions built airfields in weeks. They laid down fuel depots, radar stations, and hospitals with astonishing speed. While Japanese troops rationed rice and made sandals from rope, the Americans poured concrete for bombers that could cross oceans. It was not that Japanese soldiers lacked courage. Their willingness to sacrifice was unmatched. But the Americans had rendered courage irrelevant. The bypassed garrisons were not defeated in battle. They were defeated by logistics, by design, by being left alone. Admiral Naomi Nomura's logs confirmed the collapse of Japan's resupply strategy. Submarines were sunk trying to deliver food to Bougainville. Aircraft lost attempting to reinforce Rabaul. Convoys vanished. By April 1944, Nomura issued the order to cease all submarine resupply efforts. "We cannot justify the loss of boats for such minimal delivery," he wrote. The cost of trying to support the forgotten was simply too high, and so the strategy was complete. American submarines hunted the seas. Carrier raids bombed gardens, not guns. Garrison by garrison, hope turned into habit. The men trained for glorious death became subsistence farmers. Their enemies no longer saw them as a threat. They had become placeholders in history. Perhaps the clearest expression of this transformation came from Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi, who had kept meticulous records of Rabaul's slow starvation. His final entry read, "We have become actors in a play with no audience. Our enemies do not need to defeat us. We do not matter enough to kill." This was the war America waged, a war where the most powerful weapon was not fire or steel, but the decision not to fight. And for the Japanese warrior spirit, there was no defense against that. The most devastating evidence of the island-hopping strategy's impact emerged not from Tokyo war rooms, but from the diaries and letters of the soldiers left behind. These were not just battlefield reports, they were confessions of spiritual erosion. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed on Waleai, wrote to a comrade just days before the war ended, "We do not fear death, we fear meaninglessness. We drill with rifles we will never fire, polish bayonets that will never strike. Each morning we salute the flag, not out of pride, but habit." Across dozens of bypassed islands, this sentiment echoed. Officers and enlisted men, once trained for glorious sacrifice, found themselves trapped in a war of inertia. Their loyalty remained intact, their courage unbroken, but their purpose dismantled. On Wake Island, Rear Admiral Sakibara held daily briefings long after the last American aircraft had flown by. He issued commands, conducted inspections, ordered guard rotations, rituals in a theater without an audience. His reports to Tokyo remained formal, structured, detailed, but between the lines, a quiet desperation seeped through. No activity observed. Enemy presence minimal. Troops remained prepared. Even as starvation spread, even as disease cut ranks in half, the illusion of control remained. In Truk, Admiral Kobayashi ordered a review of anti-aircraft placements. The guns hadn't fired in months. There was no fuel, but the ritual mattered. It gave structure to the silence. What the Americans had engineered, perhaps without full awareness, was a campaign of psychological warfare so potent it collapsed an entire military doctrine. Japanese military culture glorified honorable death in combat. But the Americans had offered something far worse, irrelevance in life. Captain Shindo, the intelligence officer on Marcus Island, put it bluntly in his final assessment. "We were prepared to resist overwhelming force. We were prepared to die standing. We were not prepared to be ignored." In a war defined by brutal confrontations, the most effective victories were those won without confrontation at all. Each bypassed island was a silent graveyard, not of bodies, but of ideals. And for the warriors who had trained their entire lives for sacrifice, the realization that their deaths were no longer required was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. By choosing not to fight, the Americans had done more than conserve their own forces. They had cracked the foundation of Japanese military identity. No soldier, however brave, can withstand a war that refuses to acknowledge him. As the war ground to a close, the bypassed islands fell into a surreal twilight. Some garrisons waited months after Japan's surrender before Allied forces arrived. Others continued military routines as if peace had not yet arrived. They stood guard over rusting weapons, patrolled crumbling perimeters, and hoisted sun-faded flags. These soldiers weren't rebels or holdouts. They were men caught in the wake of a war that no longer needed them. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers resisted the truth until 1951. 6 years after the war ended, they lived in the jungle, refusing to accept the surrender. Every rustle in the trees was an enemy approach. Every American plane overhead was the beginning of an invasion that never came. Their uniforms disintegrated, ammunition corroded. But they held their positions, awaiting orders that had stopped long ago. Their story was extreme, but not unique. Throughout the Pacific, forgotten soldiers clung to a mission erased by time. They had not lost their will to fight. But without direction, even discipline became a prison. Their enemy had done something profound. It had removed not just their ability to fight, but their reason to. General Imamura, reflecting years later in his memoir, captured the paradox. We studied the great commanders, Napoleon, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, but the Americans created a strategy we never imagined. They turned our strength into our weakness. We were prepared to die gloriously. Instead, we lived meaninglessly. This was the unseen genius of the island-hopping campaign. The strategy spared the Americans from storming fortified beaches, but its greater impact was moral. Every bypassed base was a fortress that slowly collapsed under its own weight. With no enemy to fight, Japanese soldiers became caretakers of their own obsolescence. Colonel Kishimoto, once a decorated infantry commander, wrote near war's end, "My sword is clean, my men are alive, but we have been defeated in the most complete way possible. We are forgotten." And when the Americans finally did arrive, they came not as conquerors, but as caretakers. They accepted surrenders from soldiers who had never fired a shot. They took rifles rusted from ocean air. They found bunkers filled with spoiled food, makeshift farms, and journals filled with fading dreams. In this final phase of the war, the Japanese warrior spirit, once feared across Asia, had not been broken in combat, but bypassed into extinction. No battlefield claimed them. No grand final stand honored their deaths. Instead, they were left to face a more haunting truth, that they had become invisible long before they ever surrendered. As peace settled over the Pacific, the world began to tally the cost of the war. In Tokyo, trials were held. In Washington, medals were awarded. But on the bypassed islands, the final numbers told a different story. One not of battles fought, but of battles intentionally avoided. At Rabaul, nearly 100,000 Japanese troops had once stood ready to repel a massive Allied invasion. When the surrender came, 69,000 remained, not because they had triumphed in defense, but because they had never been called to defend. They had waited, and waited, and waited until the war ended without them. On Truk, 27,000 troops had been isolated. On Wolai, 6,426. At Wake, another 4,000. At Marcus, the same. Across dozens of islands, over 300,000 Japanese soldiers were rendered militarily irrelevant. They had ammunition, bunkers, aircraft, yet they never saw battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reflecting on the campaign, summarized it plainly. The quickest way to defeat Japan was not to fight the Japanese. Every island we bypassed saved American lives, ammunition, time. We turned their strength against them. General Douglas MacArthur, initially skeptical of bypassing major targets, later acknowledged its brilliance. The decision to skip Rabaul alone spared thousands of Allied lives. But it was Admiral Matome Ugaki, a senior Japanese commander, who gave the most profound assessment. "They have made our courage irrelevant, our fortifications useless, our Bushido meaningless." Japanese doctrine had been built on decisive battle, on spiritual will overcoming material disadvantage. But the Americans refused to grant them that honor. They made strategy itself obsolete. The sword remained sheathed. The warrior stood untested. And that, more than any defeat in combat, shattered the myth of invincibility. In the months following the surrender, Allied officials toured these isolated garrisons. They found regiments farming vegetables, platoons raising chickens, officers charting patrols for enemies who had never come. Some had converted airfields into rice paddies. Others had built rainwater tanks from salvaged aircraft parts. Medical records revealed staggering human tolls. Malnutrition affected over 80% of the bypassed troops. Disease claimed more than bullets ever could. Suicide, driven by despair and shame, surged as the war dragged on without combat. But perhaps the most telling legacy came from General Imamura himself. After his conviction for war crimes, he chose to live out his final years in a replica of his prison cell built in his garden. He donated all proceeds from his memoirs to the families of Allied prisoners who had died under his command. In his final chapter, he wrote, "We were not defeated by superior tactics nor superior courage. We were defeated by irrelevance." The Americans understood that to render a warrior powerless, you don't need to kill him. You only need to ignore him. And so the great island fortresses of Japan, the ones bristling with guns, filled with loyal troops, carved deep into volcanic rock, faded into the pages of history without ever hearing the roar of a full-scale invasion. They were not overcome in a blaze of combat. They were not granted the glorious death they had trained for. They were left to wither, to wait, to watch the war sail past them. The island-hopping strategy, cold and calculated, redefined what victory looked like. It wasn't measured in hills taken or bodies counted. It was measured in how little needed to be destroyed. It was war not of annihilation, but of avoidance. A strategy where time itself became the most powerful weapon. The bypassed garrisons became a tragic testament to the limits of honor-based warfare in the face of industrialized, logistical combat. These men lived, yet felt they had failed. They surrendered, yet had never fought. The jungle became their only adversary. Their code, their courage, their readiness, all turned inward, rusting and collapsing under the weight of being unneeded. For the Americans, the lesson was profound. War need not consume everything in its path. Sometimes the smartest path is to go around, not through. To neutralize without direct confrontation, to render the enemy's strength irrelevant through superior design. Admiral Nimitz called it a war of engineers. History would call it revolutionary. For the Japanese who lived through it, the lesson was more painful. That bravery without opportunity is a burden. That strategy without flexibility becomes a trap. And that the ultimate cruelty in war is not defeat, but being forgotten. In the words of Admiral Kusaka, scribbled into his final wartime journal, "The Americans taught us a new kind of warfare, one that did not attack our weapons, but our very reason to fight." These men, scattered across tiny islands, became ghosts in real time, disconnected from the outcome they once sought to shape. They were left behind not by mistake, but by design. And in that design, a new kind of war was born. One where silence, starvation, and surrender replaced gunfire and glory. For those who remember these stories, not just of the fallen, but of the waiting, the wasting, the long, quiet defeat, there is a message that echoes louder than any bomb. In war, as in life, the worst fate is not to lose. It is to be made irrelevant. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the human cost of war, the visible and the invisible. Like this video, subscribe for more untold stories from history, and share your thoughts in the comments. What does victory mean when so many are never even allowed to fight?